Once tried to test me. I ate his liver with some fava beans and a nice Chianti.
The Silence of the Lambs. Psycho.
No, after 17 years.
The Maltese Falcon. What do these three films have in common? Well, they all contain some of the most unforgettable villains in movie history. And villains are the subject of this special show, which we're calling Villains, So Bad, They're Good. I'm Roger Ebert of the Chicago Sun-Times.
And I'm Gene Siskel of the Chicago Tribune. Why a show about villains? Well, they're more interesting than heroes. They're more critical to an action movie's success than the good guys. And how movie villains have changed over the years may tell us something about our culture and ourselves. And at the end of this special show, Roger and I will each pick our favorite villain in movie history. And you're going to get some good rental ideas out of this show. All of these titles that we're going to be mentioning are available on home video. But first, back to that point about villains driving action pictures. Do you doubt it? Consider some of the most popular movies of recent years. In Fatal Attraction, Glenn Close was the extramarital affair that wouldn't take a hike.
Showing up at my appointment!
What am I supposed to do? You won't answer my calls. You changed your number. I'm not going to be ignored, Dan.
Alan Rickman seemed a whole lot smarter and more stylish than Bruce Willis in the original Die Hard.
Nice suit. John Phillips, London. I have two myself. Rumor has it Arafat buys his death.
Sharon Stone launched a major film career after a decade of B-movies by playing a femme fatale in Basic Instinct.
Killing isn't like smoking. You can quit.
And Tommy Lee Jones and Gary Busey were great bad guys in Under Siege. Why? They obviously had a ball being evil.
Welcome to the revolution.
And enjoying being evil, I think, is a key to any successful villain. Smile as you do evil, and we'll stand in line to see you defeated. And let's face it, with some of these characters, we want them to win.
You know, you're absolutely right, and oftentimes in the movies, the villain is more charming, more sophisticated, better dressed
done well
than the hero, who's usually some grungy guy that looks like he needs a hand.
And I think that that's an improvement over some of the villains in the past. If you look in the golden era of movies, I think frequently they didn't give enough color to villains. I think this sort of, you know, iconic villain was often the way it was done.
Yeah, villains have been so important in film history that you could almost argue there wouldn't be movies without them. Film is the most dynamic storytelling medium known to man, and it lends itself to melodrama and conflict. Good guys versus bad guys. One of the first really big hit films, 1903's The Great Train Robbery, seemed so realistic that some audience members ducked under their seats when the bad guy fired his pistol. Gangsters came into their own in the 30s with stylized ways of dressing and speaking. James Cagney's work in Public Enemy may actually have influenced the way that real gangsters behave.
You're yellow.
The 40s and 50s were the great decades of film noir, a genre of darkness and mean streets where villains seemed more at home than good men. Sidney Greenstreet was the slick, sinister schemer in the Maltese Falcon, and he did look like he was having fun.
I tell you right out, I'm a man who likes talking to a man who likes to talk.
Richard Widmark pushed an old lady downstairs in Kiss of Death. And what was Gloria Swanson if not an entrapping, scheming, megalomaniac villain in Sunset Boulevard?
No one ever leaves the star. That's what makes one a star.
Robert Mitchum played one of the great bad guys of all time with love tattooed on the knuckles of one hand and hate on the other in The Night of the Hunter. By the 1960s, Alfred Hitchcock was experimenting with villains who were not simply evil, but also twisted and strange, like Anthony Perkins in Psycho. And in the 70s, a character like the one John Huston played in Chinatown was not simply bad on his own, but represented evil undercurrents in society at large.
You may think you know what you're dealing with, but believe me, you don't.
And looking at that gallery of great villains, I wonder why I feel so fond of so many of them. They're evil people doing evil things, but villains are also sometimes real characters, colorful, quirky, offbeat people who behave in a way that's both creepy and sometimes amusing. As evil as he is, Norman Bates, the killer in Psycho, is also a great work of the imagination.
You know, I think with Psycho, I think what Hitchcock really kicked off is that evil is clearly among us now in ways that it's never been before. People are in great danger of being killed by some strange person. And starting with Psycho, I think we are now getting a deeper investigation into the psychosis of evil. What makes up these strange people?
It used to be that villains, it was their business to be evil. They were bank robbers, they were gangsters, it was their job. Now it's something inside, it's in their souls.
They're people, they do sick things. Why? Okay. Coming up next, we'll look at the issue of how political correctness is influencing movie villains. Can minorities be bad guys anymore?
Continuing this special program on villains, the characters you love to hate, study the villains in a nation's movies and you can draw a pretty good graph of its political opinions. The bad guy of one decade turns into the good guy of the next, and often the selections have a lot to do with racism or nationalism or trends in political allies. For example, Indians used to be villains. In John Ford's The Searchers, they were kidnapping savages. But in Dances with Wolves, the U.S. cavalry was in the wrong, and the Indians were living in harmony with nature.
Spirits are high, and overnight I have gone from a person of suspicion to one of genuine standing. I am greeted with open smiles and looks of appreciation.
In war movies, enemies are always good villains. The Japanese were brutal to POWs in The Bridge on the River Kwai.
You speak to me of code? What code? The coward code.
But in Come See the Paradise in 1990, Japanese Americans were victims of racist U.S. internment camps.
Right over there, that's it.
During the Vietnam War, the enemy was portrayed in stark terms in movies like The Deer Hunter, where they ran a brutal prison camp. Now revisionism is going on here, too, as movies like Oliver Stone's Heaven and Earth identify with Vietnamese who are the victims of both sides. After the Indians, the Russians are the longest-running villains in American movies, providing spies, saboteurs, and obstructive diplomats like those up against Sean Connery's James Bond in From Russia with Love.
Excuse me, you did say your clock was correct. Russian clocks are always correct.
But with the thaw in the Cold War, we got Sean Connery himself now as a peace-seeking Russian submarine captain in The Hunt for Red October.
I present you the ballistic missile submarine Red October. My officers and I request asylum in the United States of America.
These days, Hollywood has only a few small groups left who can still provide reliable villains. And there's another more subtle problem. Action pictures, which use the most villains, make more than half of their money overseas. So Hollywood needs good international villains, not just those that are only hated by domestic audiences.
Well, to be charitable to political correctness on villains, we're going through a phase. And the ultimate goal is to be more decent and more particular in who we pick for being evil. So that's healthy. But it did get comical in this decade, and that is when we had in D2, I know you'll remember this, who was the bad hockey team? Where were they from? Iceland.
Iceland, right. The Mighty Ducks up against those evil hockey players
They're on
from
that
Iceland.
little island, and all they do is think of evil
Yeah, but
things.
they're safe villains because who cares if they hurt the box office in Reykjavik?
You got it. Okay. So much for who can't be a villain anymore. What about villains who seem eternal? Clearly, Nazis fit the bill, and the proof of it is, I feel kind of funny talking about Nazis in anything remotely related to the world of entertainment, even here on this show. We're talking about pure evil here. In the decade following World War II, for example, Otto Preminger gave a memorable performance as a Nazi camp commandant in Stalag 17.
Nobody has ever escaped from Stalag 17. Not alive, anyway.
And Stanley Kramer's Judgment at Nuremberg from 1961 even had a Nazi officer, Burt Lancaster, turn on his own kind.
Emil Hahn. The decayed, corrupt bigot, obsessed by the evil within himself.
Of course, in the most heralded film in recent years, Steven Spielberg's Schindler's List, a Nazi commandant is shown shooting Jews for target practice, while the same day, being infatuated with a Jewish prisoner.
Is this the face of a rat? Are these the eyes of a rat?
Arab assassins and terrorists have been credible villains for decades, going back to Alfred Hitchcock's The Man Who Knew Too Much from 1956.
Hey, look there.
And as long as Arab terrorists bomb international airplanes and New York City skyscrapers, pictures like True Lies won't think twice about portraying a Middle Eastern menace.
Do you know why you've been brought here? So that this man can verify to the world the Crimson Jihad is now a nuclear power.
Another staple, the political assassin. He's been with us a long time and never better portrayed than in The Manchurian Candidate, which was released 1 year before President Kennedy's murder. Following the Kennedy assassination, fame-seeking creeps pop up every year in the movies, sometimes in films of quality like Taxi Driver. Another great assassin, John Malkovich in The Line of Fire. What about generic bad guys of no specific nationality? In the James Bond films, villains like Klaus Maria Brandauer and Never Say Never Again want to control nothing less than the world entire.
Begin. Thank you, gentlemen. The eternal battle for the domination of the world begins. We play for dollars. Random target selection, Spain.
Actually, a lot of villains today are not interested in controlling the world. More typically today, we're getting a more modest goal. Money. Lots of it. Villains don't want to control others anymore. They don't like other people. They don't want to be around them. They just want what the big guys have. Lots of dough.
Maybe this reflects kind of the mirror image of what society wants.
Yes.
In the 60s and 70s, things were more idealistic. People wanted to change the world, so villains wanted to run the world.
Okay.
Today, people want to make lots of money, so villains want to make even more money.
You got it.
It may be very simple.
Villains tell us a lot about ourselves.
Yes,
when we
they do.
come back, what makes a good villain and why? Continuing our special show, what makes a good movie villain? Well, I've already mentioned the most important quality. They've got to enjoy doing evil. Here's an example from 1994. Dennis Hopper in Speed, the best of the many mad bombers we've been getting lately.
A woman caught in the blast fell. She was pulled under the wheels. This is terrible.
Interactive TV, Jack. Wave of the future.
Another key ingredient to being an effective bad guy or gal is intelligence. James Woods typically plays smart bad guys, as in against all odds.
Listen, you didn't finish the job, so I don't owe you the rest of the money, okay? I figure you just came over today to say we're still friends.
So I guess for me, those are the two crucial qualities that make a great villain. They're smart, and they enjoy it.
And maybe the third quality in modern movies particularly is they're so well dressed and so well behaved. You know, in the old days, it was always the heroes who really looked great, and
yes,
the villains who kind of came in needing a shave, you know. And today, when you go to the movies, it's always the villain who looks like he walked right out of the pages of GQ.
They don't have a regular job, so they have plenty of time to shop for clothes, I guess.
Apart from villains who are just plain hateful, my favorite villains are those who are funny, or charming, or very weird. There are certain things I'm happy to find in a movie villain. For example, ingratiating smarminess, as demonstrated here by M. Emmett Walsh, the crooked, greedy private eye in Blood Simple.
Give me a call whenever you want to cut off my head. I can always crawl around without it.
Or an interior struggle between good and evil, as with Hannibal Lecter, played by Anthony Hopkins in The Silence of the Lambs. It was as if, given his twisted nature, he was as good as he could be.
You think if Catherine lives, you won't wake up in the dark ever again to that awful screaming of the lambs.
Now, a common thread of a lot of those villains is that they are all male, but one interesting thing about the later 80s and now in the 90s is that there are so many more female villains than there used to be, and maybe that's telling us something about ourselves, too. We're going to look at that when we come back. Continuing our special show on villains, so bad they're good. We've gotten this far without using the term anti-hero, and yet a lot of Hollywood villains do fall into that category. They exist in a world so bleak and empty of moral values that their behavior is like a statement saying, things may be rotten, but at least I still exist. Some of the strongest and most controversial recent films fall into that category, including Oliver Stone's Natural Born Killers, in which Woody Harrelson and Juliette Lewis were killers who became media celebrities.
But they always leave one clerk alive.
to tell the tale of Mickey and Mallory.
Or look at Quentin Tarantino's Reservoir Dogs with its career criminals who try to maintain a certain professionalism even as all of their plans are falling to pieces.
And you give yourself a couple of seconds, you get a hold of the situation, you deal with it. What you don't do is start shooting up the place and start killing people.
And, of course, the most influential example of this trend, Bonnie and Clyde from 1967, once again with killers who become media darlings.
Hold it, hold it!
Movies like that create the most controversy because you either get the message or you're offended by it. Is Natural Born Killers about the way criminals are glamorized by the media, or is it an example of killers being glamorized by the media? Well, I think you can make a case for either side of that question, which is one reason such movies are so intriguing. They force you to take a stand.
I also think they come out of a mindset that says, I don't believe in traditional good guys anymore. I think that the bad guys might be the good guys, and so I'm going to take a look at the bad guys as a way of highlight the conventional bad guys and put them up on top and maybe look elsewhere to see what the causes of evil are. I think that's what's going on.
What they're saying then is that the bad guys are symptoms of some kind of a deep illness in society.
Okay, let's get to the women. The most obvious area in which the movies glamorize villains is with women. It's been a long time since we've seen an ugly villain like decades ago with Lotte Lenya in From Russia with Love. Today, the leading female villains are played by bombshells, such as Teresa Russell in Black Widow.
Mr. Shin, I'll tell you two things about me. I'm very rich. And I'm very wealthy.
And Rebecca De Mornay in The Hand That Rocks the Cradle.
When your husband makes love to you, it's my face he sees.
And Linda Fiorentino in The Last Seduction.
No names. Meet me outside.
Now, what's going on with these bad beauties? And I mean beautiful. These are some of the most beautiful women in the movies, and they're playing very bad characters. I think they play into modern American man's fear of the liberated woman. Also, the notion that sex is dangerous can be very exciting to audiences. Bombshell bad girls are a way of safely sneaking in a little S&M into mainstream entertainment.
You know, I think you're right with all 3 points,
Yep.
and there's another point. I really want to get cynical now.
Okay.
It's been pointed out that very rarely do the movies have realistic three-dimensional portraits of women.
Right.
And yet we have all of these female roles in which women are killers, they're sadistic, they're dangerous, they're vipers, they're going to chew you up and spit you out.
Right.
And I think that maybe that reflects an idea in Hollywood about women, a kind of a fear of women in Hollywood.
I've questioned that before. Do they like women out there? And I think the answer is, based on what we're getting, no. When we come back, we'll name, each of us, our favorite villains in movie history. Concluding now our special show on villains so bad they're good, it's time for Roger and me to select each of our favorite villains in movie history. And I decided I couldn't really choose among the worst or the most sinister bad guys, so I went out into left field, so to speak, for my favorite villain, out into space, actually, for the most surprising villain I've ever seen in a motion picture. Let's just start the movie, and I'll let you discover the villain the fabulous way we all did some 27 years ago.
Well, as far as I know, no 9,000 computers have been disconnected.
Oh, no 9,000 computers ever fouled up before.
That's not what I mean.
Huh?
Well, I'm not so sure what he'd think about it.
Yes, it's the power-mad HAL 9000 computer in Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey, here eavesdropping on astronauts Keir DeLay and Gary Lockwood. Eventually, DeLay tries to dismantle HAL over the machine's protests.
I honestly think you ought to sit down calmly, take a stress pill, and think things over.
What's the real evil in HAL? No, not the computer chip. It's the impulse to control others, the people that built the computer, the root cause, I think, of so much of the evil in the world. Unlike most every villain in the movies, even the great ones, HAL wasn't introduced to us as a bad guy. He just shocked us in a way that none of us will ever forget.
And I remember that so clearly, Gene, when I was watching the movie. I thought, oh my God, HAL is not on their side.
Unbelievable.
He's mad because they want to run the space station.
And isn't it true, Roger, that the idea to control is really, if you come down to it, it's the evil person makes the judgment, I have the right to control you.
Okay, when I was asking myself for the name of my favorite villain, there wasn't an instant of doubt in my mind. I didn't have to wait 1 second to know that his name was Harry Lime, and he was played by Orson Welles in the title role of the great 1949 movie named the Third Man. Harry Lime doesn't even turn up until the last third of the movie as a black marketeer whose adulterated medicine has killed innocent children. But when he does, it's the most famous entrance in movie history. And the movie ends with a famous chase in the perfect place for a rat like Harry, the sewers. Harry Lime is a liar, a killer, and a fraud, but he is also very intelligent and charming enough to fool both his best friend and his best girl, even while betraying both of them. He's my favorite movie villain of all time, and I think we picked a couple of good ones, and those movies wouldn't even exist if it weren't for their villains.
That's it for this special show. Next week, we'll be back with a look at some more great video rentals for summer in a special show we're calling The Sunny Side of the Screen. Hot weather movies, that's next week, and until then, the balcony is closed.